Can you see what is wrong with this M4 build, even at first glance? Today, we're back with the Repairing a Weapons series, and this build, let's be honest, it should be illegal, and whoever made it locked up for crimes against Tarkov. This specimen was found on Shoreline in the unsuspecting hands of a level 31 PMC, which is why I think that they were probably not the one that built it originally. What makes this one so spectacularly awful is that it's basically the old meta M4 build, but the designer has stumbled at the last hurdle and managed to use two of the absolute worst ergo to recoil attachments possible, bringing this M4 into the performance range of a fairly lightly modded budget build instead at 3 times the price. So this weapon build is quite incredible, and as you can see, it does have most of the sort of top recoil reducing components on it, which aren't really that meta anymore, but it gets you to the lowest recoil M4, at least one of them. And as you can see, so it's got the MUR here. This is just tucked behind the RK2. This is the lowest recoil upper that you can get. The RK2 itself being the lowest recoil foregrip, but obviously these things come with ergo disadvantages. And when you look across the whole weapon, most of it's like this. You know, you've got the advanced tube here. You've even got the red version, which is the special one off the flea market that's not on the traders, that gives you a little bit more accuracy. And then you've also got things like the 13.7 Handsome barrel, the Raptor charging handle, the SIA QD handguard. The list just goes on. Basically, the whole gun is so close to being a meta weapon, not necessarily for this patch, as I said, but for previous patches where recoil was preferable. Now, what ends up being the absolute killer for this is both the combination of the muzzle brake and the foregrip. These two things combined together are just absolutely awful. The problem with the RK2 is that you lose a lot of ergonomics for getting that one extra point of recoil. Even against something that isn't actually that good for recoil, like the RK1, this thing at least gives you +1. So this is a 9 ergonomic swing for a 1% increase in recoil reduction, which just simply isn't worth it. Then turning that on its head, we then have the Hybrid 46, which has one of the worst recoils out of all of the possible suppressors that you could put on here, but the ergonomics is a bit better. But the issue here is that the combination of these two things mean that it just completely destroys the overall build. So I'll show you exactly, and this is without any magazine, by the way, so we haven't even put in a 60 round or a 40 round or something like that. This gun starts at 59 ergonomics and 61 vertical recoil, which if you're used to building M4s, you'll probably know is like very, very average. For these parts, it's incredible they've actually managed to get these stats on it. It's quite unbelievable, really. So the first and most obvious one is obviously the RK2. We'll swap the RK2 out for something else. The typical, most traditional one is the SE5. This is really good bang for buck. You only lose 2 recoil points here because the SE5 is -2% rather than -4, but you get 16 ergo. This is a huge, huge quantity, and this allows us to then replace the suppressors with something that has less ergonomics on it. So if we put the SE5 on, we now get to 75 ergo and hardly lose any recoil on the flip side. Now, the one thing I will mention about the SE5 is that in my research looking at Tarkov DB and some of the overswing calcs and things like that, a couple of people pointed out to me that actually these AFG M-locks are really not that bad because they're slightly lighter. It's not by a lot, but it's 120 grams or something, and you only gain 1 ergonomics by going up to the SE5. These two things are almost indistinguishable between the AFG M-locks and the SE5. So if you want to put an AFG M-lock on here, that is absolutely fine, and the performance difference is basically negligible between these two things, and these are a hell of a lot cheaper. So even if you do have the SE5 unlocked, you actually might just want to go for an AFG M-lock anyway, because the difference is so minute. But just because we want to get the absolute best that we can out of this build, we're going to go to the SE5. It is technically very, very slightly better, but it really is neither here nor there. And then we've got to go and look at the suppressor. So now that we're not using the Hybrid 46, we can get rid of this. We can go to the best build, which is the Griffin. One of the most irritating parts about Tarkov's weapon builder is that every time you come into these menus, all of the stuff is in a different order, and I think it's technically by design, something to combat against botting or whatever in like other areas of Tarkov, but in the weapon builder, it's completely unnecessary to do this. I wish it was just alphabetical or something, so it's at least the same every time you go in here. But anyway, so the G-Lock is the best muzzle brake that you could get because it combines with a very good suppressor, which is this one here, the M4 SDK. And this one is technically the best combination that you can get. For a couple of patches now, the best suppressors in Tarkov in terms of recoil have all been the same top 4. So you've got the G-Lock with the M4 SDK, you've got the Seika with its associated suppressor, the AAC Blackout, and you also have the Thor as well. And these ones, the only thing that differs between them is the ergonomics. So the reason why the G-Lock is better than the Seika suppressor, for example, is that it's a bit better on ergo. So you can see here we get down to 52 vertical recoil with 72 ergo, which is pretty insane. This is very, very good. Now, they are quite expensive, so this is building a meta weapon at the moment. I'll talk to you about what I would build right now if you want to kind of match this build without actually spending as much money. But if we want to get the absolute best build that we can out of this gun and repair it, because most of the base body is already here, right? This is what's so frustrating about it. Then we will go with the G-Lock instead. So between literally these two things, we've changed this from a very mediocre gun into a gun that's really quite good. 72 ergonomics and 52 vertical recoil. This is extremely powerful. Now, there are other things you can do to this, but these are kind of adjustments. We're just trying to move this into the meta weapon. If you were to build a gun like this completely from scratch these days, I do think that there are some other bang for buck changes that you can make. Obviously, I probably wouldn't change this gun to make it like that, because it's just not really worth it to change out barrels or change out, different parts of this to swap everything over, especially if they're expensive parts already. So if it was me running this gun, I would just change these 2 bits and then I'd just leave it at that and I'd use it. But if I'm going to build it from scratch, I want to get the best gun I can, rather than having the horrible Mongol that we had a moment ago. There's a few other changes that I would make. So we talked about the MUR, this one being the lowest vertical recoil out of all of them. Now, I usually prefer, if I can, to get the AX15. So this is only 3% recoil reduction rather than 4%, but it gives you 14 ergo rather than 8. And I will always take 6 ergonomics over 1 recoil, unless you really are up in the super high levels of ergonomics. And this is because it gives you the scope to run 60 rounders and that kind of thing without jeopardizing the build, because it often looks quite good originally when you're building these things, and then you stick a mag in and you're like, oh, it doesn't actually look that good anymore. So even at 72, for example, say it's difficult for you to access the P mag, then you put the mag 5 in and all of a sudden you've got 54 ergonomics. It doesn't quite look as crazy anymore. So unfortunately with this, if you do change it over, you have to basically rebuild that whole gun. So I'm going to do that now. And I'm just making sure that this gets back to exactly how it was before, so that I don't, mess up the build or whatever. But this now takes us to 78 ergonomics and 54 vertical recoil. So we're really giving away only small amounts of vertical recoil in order to boost this ergo and make our weapon nicer to use with big magazines, which is kind of the meta, right? Like having a 60 rounder in M4 is way better than having a 30. Now, kind of opposite to this, the barrel, I'm actually going to take it from the short barrel to the long barrel. This is something I don't usually do, but the difference between the Hansen 13 and the Hansen 16 is not that much in terms of ergonomics. We're actually only losing 3 ergo and we're gaining 2 recoil. That ratio is actually pretty good. So I'm going to take over the Hansen 16 instead. We're going to add the low pro gas block back on, and we're also going to put the G-lock and add the M4 SDK back on as well. So this now takes us to 75 ergo and 51 vertical recoil. So we've actually got some of this back by doing this. And I actually think that that is pretty good. I quite like the 16-inch Hansen barrel because, as I said, you don't lose that much for putting it on. A lot of the other parts here are pretty good. As I said, we've got the ARE here, we've got the MOE and rubber butt pad. This is kind of personal preference as to whether you want to use this or the Daniels Defense version. They're really just like sliding up the scales of ergo and recoil. None of them are strictly better than each other, but this is, a perfectly valid choice for a high ergo M4. And so that makes the rest of these things just kind of micro adjustments around the outside that are interesting to see, but let's just do them anyway. They've got the Chris Defiance front and rear sights on. These give +1 ergonomics. That's fine. We don't need to touch that. The one part about the scope mount, we're using the LeBev here. If I'm using cheap-ish scope mounts, I usually like to use the Night Force one, but it's not necessarily the best. Even the Night Force one loses 1 ergonomics. And the one that you want to use if you are actually going for, complete best for best is the Geisley Super Precision, because this gives you half an ergo point. And then you put on the top cap as well. This gives you another half ergo point. So that's actually a swing of 2 ergo. So when you put the Voodoo back in this, now you have 2 ergo more than you did before. So it's now at 77, which is pretty nice. And then the last thing, if you really want to squeeze every last piece of potential out of this weapon, then on this particular handguard, you have these canted mounts that you can put on. These ones here, these M-Lock cantilever mounts, which are quite interesting. So you put those on and they give you 1 extra ergonomics and they hardly weigh anything. It's like 50 grams. And so bang for buck, this ends up working out quite well. They're not even that much actually once you have them unlocked. I think there's 2 that you can put on in total, which is just these 2 on the side, but that gives you a little bit of extra ergo, and that now takes us to 79 ergo and 51 vertical recoil, which is pretty insane. So even if you are putting on the cheaper of the 60 rounders, you still have 61 ergo. This is insane. LPVO, suppressed, 60 round mag, you're above 60 ergonomics. It's only 4 kilograms. I know we don't have this full of ammo yet, so that will have a big effect because, big mags, they have a lot more ammo in them, so the weight effect is there, but this has such high ergo that it counteracts it. You're not going to have like overswing or anything like that. Yes, you can technically have it slightly snap you in ADS if you have a smaller magazine, but if you want a big mag, you want to play kind of meta, then this is the best thing you can really do. The Balder Pro, obviously this is really dependent on what you like to do. I like the WMX 200 for the reasons I've talked about in lots of my different videos, in that when you put this thing on, you have an option of having an IR floodlight, and that one doesn't show up in the day to anybody, and so you can just basically have the point fire bonus, which is a dramatic increase in point fire accuracy, without showing anybody that you've got your tactical device on, so they don't know you're coming, which is really handy. It's kind of the default mode that I use on my weapons once I have it unlocked and once I've kind of got a bit of extra cash. So yeah, we don't need to change anything about this. It's already got the Low Pro, which is the best gas block that you can have. It's got the Raptor, which is the best charging handle that you can have. And as I said, the only other thing that you might want to change is the MOE over to the Daniels Defense if you wanted a bit more ergo. But at this point, it doesn't really matter. Even if you did change this, so 60 and 51 right now, if you put the Daniel's Defense on and then the ergonomic butt pad, you're going to 64 and 54, or you're going from 62 and 52. So it's kind of like just differences around the edges. It doesn't really make much difference, but this gun will be an absolute beast. Now, I do just want to show you the difference between, this is the original build that we were looking at, and this is the build that I just kind of pulled out of my stash because it was one that I've been using relatively recently. And you can see the difference between these. Like, I've got 4 worse recoil, but 10 more ergonomics, and I don't have any good parts really on this at all. The best part that I have on my build on this right-hand side is the advanced tube, which I got from Mechanic 4. And you can even buy these from the flea now. They're nowhere near as hard to get as they used to be. If you have a look on ARE, and a lot of people are flipping these things, so you can actually just buy the advanced tubes now as a player that doesn't have Mechanic 4, and it's so much more cost effective. You're paying 6k for the advanced tube. I think this is definitely worth getting, I think, in my opinion. And so you can see that they've managed to clutch defeat from the jaws of victory, while we've got a lighter gun, which has got better ergo. The recoil is almost the same. Now, the only reason why my one is so bad on recoil, relatively speaking, is because I'm using this. This is my favorite suppressor at the moment, the Mini Monster, for budget builds, because usually on budget builds, you kind of end up hurting for ergo a little bit. And as I said, because the recoil doesn't matter as much anymore, I tend to use this guy because it's got such good ergonomic profile versus the recoil. This is only minus 5% recoil, which isn't amazing, but minus 7 ergo is insane. And you're suppressed, and the gun is short. It makes it easy to fight inside and all that kind of stuff. Another reason is that I'm focusing on ergonomics on this build, as I said before, and so I've gone for the Daniel's Defense plus the butt pad here on this build as well. And you can see that it really comes out to something very, very similar to the other weapons. So this is what I tend to be using right now. I've got the Night Force mount on here, and the handguard I'm using is this Mark 10. The Mark 10 is good because it's one of the few handguards with minus 3. This is actually the same as the SAI handguards, the big long one, the 14-inch one that was on the other build, but it's a fraction of the price. So this thing is only 20k, and the SAI one is 76,000 rubles from Skier, which is kind of nuts, right? This is like 12 ergonomics versus whatever this is, which is plus 8. So it's 4 ergonomics. You're paying a lot of money. So if you want a budget build, I always usually go for the Mark 10 because it's so good bang for buck. You can get something with a bit better ergonomics if you want to, but I find that recoil is kind of hard to get on the handguards, and you can get ergonomics other ways with the Growl and whatever. So the Growl, again, is another really good attachment. This one you can also buy off the flea market. This is probably, with the dollar conversion, this is probably about the same price it is on Peacekeeper, so you can basically buy Peacekeeper 4 attachments at level 15 as soon as you reach the flea, which is awesome. And I think if you did want to match that build a bit closer to this build, then rather than having the Mini Monster on here, I'd probably go for the RC2. The RC2 is one of the better bang for buck suppressors. Yes, you do lose a lot of ergo, but that's because the Mini Monster is so good, and you gain 2 recoil, which I don't think is worth it personally, but if you do like that kind of thing, then you can go for the RC2. Just for a bit of a comparison, if you did decide to go for the G-Lock, this would get you to 57 ergonomics and 58 vertical recoil. So the difference isn't actually that much, especially if you're looking at a budget build. And as you can see with the Mini Monster, you're losing 6 recoil, but you gain about 10 ergo. So I think this is pretty good. This is what I kind of am intending to run now in the mid game, I should say, without starting to upgrade anything else. Like, I haven't upgraded the lower receiver. I haven't changed over the barrel, still just using the 370mm barrel. I haven't upgraded the charging handle or anything. We haven't got the crisp front and rear sights on. This is a very, very basic build. It's like super easy to make, and it does perform quite well. Honestly, I quite like this thing. I think the only issue with this is that it is a little bit expensive, and sometimes you think, well, maybe I would just buy a G36 instead, which is sort of my go-to 5.56 weapon these days, just because they're so easy to mod. I have this G36 build. I know we're kind of going off topic here, but I'll show it to you anyway, just because it's so similar, right? 800 RPM for the M4. This is my G36 rebuild, and this is because I was basically converting long G36s into this one. And this is, again, it's a Mini Monster build, but this has 750 RPM, so it's very close to the M4. The recoil is not quite as good with 67, but the ergo is fine. And the gun actually is really decent. This is so cheap to make because you hardly have to mod anything, right? Your pistol grip is just as is. The top rail is as is. The handguards are dirt cheap. If you buy the C version from Peacekeeper or from the flea market, it's like $21 for a 2-vent handguard. Like, everything about the G36 is insanely cheap. If you go and find parts on this thing, this is just buying everything straight up. You 158k for the whole thing, and you don't actually need most of this stuff because a lot of these things actually come with the build. You've got like these side rails which come with it. You've got the mag itself, the vent handguard, which maybe you want to buy if you're doing a conversion, but sometimes you can find them cheaper. This thing up the top, and the stock you already get as well. So we're actually talking, you know, much more like 120k or something. So I do really like the G36. I think this is the thing for me now. If you are going to build a mid-range M4, maybe just think about buying a G36 first. And you don't have to buy one from Peacekeeper directly. You can go and get one off the flea market, and they're not always available. Like, this one's actually a cracking purchase. That's just genuinely mispriced there because it's got a scope on it and everything else. But you could go and just buy one of these long ones and then modify it as I showed you with the short barrel and the short handguard. And then you can actually sell a lot of the G36 big version back to the traders. So a lot of this cost ends up coming back, and it ends up being about 100k for the build, which is a lot cheaper than what the M4 is likely going to be, unless you're trying to cut into those upper echelons of performance. So next up, let's go and check out how my M4 build has been doing in a few raids. I only need to kill one more actual rogue. Did I see somebody there? Or am I completely... I saw his foot. I screwed that up. Oh, wait, I thought I killed him. Never mind. Oh, I did. There were two. Annoying. So that's like better than the standard. And then you obviously go towards the Epsilon. But then you also you get the trader rep increase. I believe. I believe that version gets trader rep increase. I can't remember what they're called. Oh, for... I was like, oh, we've gone around that area so much now that it should be fine.
Connor, I'm done.
I was going to go further back just in case there's a teammate or something. It did sound... I bet it's BCP or something. I don't know, either MAT? Oh. Maybe, yeah, maybe you just got the unlucky roll. Vault, vault, vault. Let me get it. Thank you. Ah, just level 42 like me. Remember that he shot out your stomach and 2 limbs. I mean, the back plate is like nearly dead. So it must have taken 2 or 3 hits at least. So if you do want to see more about the G36 build, I do have a lot more information in the level 2 traders video over here. Otherwise, as usual, big shout out to all my patrons. And as always, have fun in your raids.